while we wait for the rest of the attendees to join. So if anyone wants to grab their water, their tea, you have a few minutes to do so. Thank you for joining.
ممكن كمان تقولي الكلام اللي قلتيه بالعربي يا أمينة؟
أهلا ومرحبا بكم في الفعالية بتاعت النهاردة. احنا هننتظر مجموعة من الدقائق لحد ما بقية المشاركين يدخلوا على الفعالية، وهنبتدي خلال دقيقتين أو ثلاثة. شكرا جزيلا للضمان. Okay, so let us go ahead and start. In the very beginning, I want to say hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us. I just want to remind everyone that interpretation in Arabic is available, so if anyone wants to use the Arabic channel, they can do so. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم، شكرا لانضمامكم. أنا بس كنت عايزة أشارككم إنه في ترجمة للغة العربية متوفرة، وممكن تستخدموا علامة الكرة الأرضية تحت الشاشة عشان تختاروا القناة العربي وتستمعوا للترجمة. شكرا جزيلا مجددا لانضمامكم للفعالية بتاعة النهاردة. I'm not going to go on too long. I just wanted to say thank you everyone for joining. This is our last webinar this year, which for me at least it's a big deal. So I'm not going to take too much time. I'm going to hand it over to my boss, mentor, director, friend, Shereen. Shereen, you have the floor. Please walk us through the IMF surcharges webinar.
Thank you, Amina. And that was my colleague, Amina Sharaf, our climate and economical justice lead at MENA Fem. Thanks a lot for all of you for being here today. شكرا للجميع على الحضور النهاردة. أنا شيرين طلعت، المديرة التنفيذية لحركة مينا فام للعدالة الاقتصادية والإيكولوجية من الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا. زي ما قالت زميلتي آمنة، في ترجمة للغة العربية. أرجوكوا روحوا الكرة الأرضية تحت الشاشة واختاروا الترجمة للغة العربية. Again, there is translation to Arabic and English. Please go to the globe down the screen and choose the language that you prefer. Well, it's our last webinar in the year, and actually it's our Happy New Year gift from MENAFem to you all. I hope it will be an interesting discussion. It's a very important, and I have all my heart to this discussion. Because for years as activists, as MENAFem group colleagues who are already here, and including UN special rapporteurs, including academia, including different country representatives, civil society. I'm here among my dear colleagues from CEPR and from Bretton Woods Project, who we shared the passion from years ago, and we all were on one heart, as we say in Arabic, على قلب واحد, on one heart, to working forward to lead a campaign to eliminate the IMF surcharges. That started years ago, and the efforts that we made together and we pushed forward together actually came with some fruits, with the decision that the IMF announced in October. Well, and I also, before going to open this discussion, I want to thank every person by name and organization that shared this passion, that was part of the Stop the IMF Surcharge campaign. Of course, my colleagues at CEPR and Bretton Woods Projects, but also our colleagues at Eurodad, at Ladendad, at Elsevier, Germany, Jubilee, Germany, and different groups from Ukraine, different groups from my colleagues in MENA. It was a very heart-burning issue that was impacting us all. And there was a lot of effort behind. I remember the first statement that we released formally as the Stop IMF Surcharge campaign. We had around from 300 to 500 signatories, and we also thanks a lot for different efforts, as I mentioned, from politicians, from academia, from the UN special rapporteurs. We are having here my dear colleague Attiya, Waris, who were one of the also backbones of this campaign. She supported as the UN debt and the human rights special rapporteur with other special rapporteurs the asks of the campaign. Surcharges are additional fees that was imposed by the IMF on non-consensual loans, increasing the financial burden on borrowing countries, and fees that actually wasn't fully disclosed, making it more difficult to track the cost of these surcharges in our economy. Surcharges actually was deepen the inequalities and diverting resources away from essential public services and recovery efforts. Middle-income nations bear the burden of these fees while receiving minimal debt relief support between 2019 and 2023. The number of countries subjected to those surcharges grew from 8 to 16, and actually this year it was risen to 22 countries. Over the past years, we've worked tirelessly to implement a variety of strategies aimed to eliminate this unfair policy, the surcharges that was imposed by the IMF. Following the efforts of civil society organizations like MENAFem, CEPR, and BWB, as I mentioned earlier, and in October this year, the IMF approved reforms to reduce borrowing costs, but chose to reduce rather than eliminate surcharges. We were actually expecting more than this. The decision came as a result of years of advocacy efforts from the Stop IMF Surcharge campaign and allies. But we expected a result that would far exceed the 36% reduction we got at this critical time that our world is facing. This decision wasn't, as I mentioned, was under our expectations, but we cannot deny that it also helped different countries. But let's say that for us, it was disappointing, especially for many of us who are living under those policies in the MENA region and the global south. While IMF surcharges lower costs slightly, they still are 13 countries facing surcharges by 2026. continuing financial strain of nations, especially in Africa, where public debt has tripled since 2008. The IMF discusses surcharges reform every 5 years. This is the new reform. That is, so the next review will be after 5 years. That means for us in the global south, thousands of days, thousands of dinners that are not served on the table because there is no money, thousands of days of struggling with healthcare, education, and inflation, day in, day out. As we reflect on this journey, we want to shed light on these implications, but we also want to highlight how our work and tactics as a campaign contributed to our overall objectives and lessons we've learned along way. The reforms are milestones worthy of reflection and acknowledgement today. We'll be walking you through this impacts of surcharges and our journey through the campaign. And I'm here. I am happy to share this discussion with dear colleagues from the Stop IMF Surcharge campaigns. Luis Vieira, the coordinator of the Bretton Woods Project, and also our colleagues, and I hope that most of them are attending the session, our colleagues from CEPR, and we're having here Ivana Beskalovic, the Senior Research Associate from the Center Economic and Policy Research. But we also happy to have our dear friend and actually mentor, Attiya Waris, the UN independent expert of human rights and foreign debt. And we're also going to know more and know some reflections from Mr. Bruno Coehlo Servia, the ED, Executive Director of the International Monetary Fund on Brazil. And we're going to listen from a former ED, Mr. Sergio Chodos, the Chief Legal Officer of Argentina Crown Point Energy, who was the ED, a former ED of Argentina. Argentina was one of the highest countries that was paying surcharges, and actually the reason behind how we know that those surcharges exist. So allow me to go first to Attiya. And Attiya, it would be great if you shed some lights with us on your reflections around surcharge and the new reform, but also your contribution in the campaign. Thank you, Attiya, for being there. I know that you are in Thailand now, very different time. So Attiya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I did not know how to say no to speaking about this topic. There was no way of saying no, Shereen. It was so important. 3 years ago, when I began my mandate, I heard about the conversations around surcharges, and the first thing that struck me was how much of a penalty it was. If you cannot pay a lower amount, you get to pay a higher amount. But just plain logic was like it was not, as some young people say, the maths was not mathing. It just didn't make sense. If a country cannot do a 1% interest rate, how is it going to be possible for it to do 3%? And it may sound simple. I mean, if you look at the figures, they say over the next 5 years, 9.8 billion is what's going to be due on surcharges. And in the world of finance, $9.8 billion is not that high. But it's the repercussions around it that continue to cause even more of a challenge. And so I did write a letter to the executive director of the IMF. I raised the concerns. And for me, the biggest challenge in this conversation was the trade-off. And the trade-off was going to be not just how much money they would have to remit, but the kind of insane pressure that gets then put not only on a country, but its population, because the country is constantly trying to take more cash dollars out of the economy, currency rates start fluctuating, and that pressure point becomes so high in some countries that you can feel the populations breaking, which brings me to what my mandate is about, which is about the human rights angle to it. And so based on that, I wrote a letter, thanks to actually civil society response and support. I finally got a response to the letter, but it wasn't very useful. However, it did begin or re-begin conversations between mandate holders and the IMF. We have periodic consultations with them. They now send us their newsletters. They try and speak with us whenever we can and are available. But when I looked at the proposed reforms, I was also disappointed, frankly. There are two sentences that came out quite strongly for me. One was that abolishing or suspending is possible but radical. And I thought, well, okay, so that means there is no appetite to be a little bit radical. The second thing that struck me was there was no mention of climate change. This surprised me in some of the earlier documents, that while there was now recognition of COVID in this whole reform process, there isn't yet a recognition of climate. And when I look at the countries on the list, countries like Pakistan that has had floods, and Egypt, and of course Argentina as well, but Ecuador, I mean, climate change is really affecting a lot of countries. It is crippling their economies. And so I wonder how many more will end up on the list anyway. And I think this is the assessment that I'm not so clear on, is under the current system, they think it'll go down to 16 countries. But I wonder, because climate is not going to be something that we can really predict, there is a chance it might be more countries rather than less countries. So I think this for me was a gap in the conversation. The third item I kept hearing everywhere was their interest rates are slightly lower than market. And from a human rights perspective, I don't believe that interest rates from an entity that is supposed to be supporting development and stability should be slightly lower than market. I think the interest rate should be much lower than market. This for me is about the profitability conversation and how much profit the entity is then making out of it. So this sort of conversation, I think, for me was very important, because I really struggled with the approach they've decided to take. I know the world is in an economic crisis and all entities are going to struggle. But if this entity, the IMF, is truly supposed to be there in order to help development and I believe to alleviate poverty, then I think the tone of the conversation really needs to change from what is coming out of the IMF, and it isn't. And so I want to close with one last thing, and that is, I saw a lot of reference to credit rating agencies like Standard & Poor's. But at the end of the day, the IMF is part of a global structure of international institutions that are part of the UN. They form part of the UN country teams now, for example, at national level. Yet I don't see reference to other types of measures, like UNDESA has a multi-vulnerability index, for example. And so what really struck me as well was the absence of a more approachable form of measurement, and why there is this continued use of private entities in the assessment, which is what credit rating agencies are. I want to stop there because I want to hopefully also have some time to hear other people speaking, but I thank you very much for the time. I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks a lot, Attiya, and thanks a lot for your reflections. And yes, I remember when you first sent this letter, and thank you for also advocating and mobilizing more rapporteurs and active rapporteurs on this topic. And we remember also how we didn't receive reply. I guess we received a reply after 9 months or a year. Yes, from the IMF. And on this, I know because we had during the time as a campaign different discussions with different ADs and inside the IMF with different also part of the staff and the management. So there was a lot of discussions, and we're this is something that we are proud as a campaign to to put the surcharges on the agenda of the IMF ADs to be able to discuss. It was there, and it was impacting our life. It was imposed for a year, and it wasn't on the table of discussion. But having this October decision on surcharges raises a lot of questions, and I hope we can know more about those discussions internally inside during the time with the ADs, but also what we can also expect forward. And here I invite Mr. Bruno Coehlo, the executive director on Brazil. I know, Bruno, that your term is ending, but you were during this very hot topic time for us. So Bruno, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shereen. Thanks to all organizers and also Waris for putting me in contact with this important discussion. Let me first start with the disclaimer, because as I'm still and actually an alternate ED, not an ED, until Wednesday, I need to start by saying that I'm going to express here my own views, not the views of the board or the fund. So, and also there is a more, let's say, personal disclaimer, because I mean the movers are arriving at any moment here in my house. So if you see myself being hauled by some people, it's because they are here, and I may need to interrupt my participation, and I couldn't, let's say, properly prepare for this event. But I'll try to say just a few words about the process at the board and some issues related to this very important discussion, and share the disappointment about what has been proposed as a reform for both charges and surcharges recently approved. It was a way short of what it could have been, and even if it improved the situation for many borrowers, not in the way that it should. And the one thing that we must acknowledge is that any progress that we had in this discussion was to a large extent due to the mobilization of civil society. If it were not by your efforts to raise this issue, sending letters, pushing the discussion, I can't see the needle moving at the IMF board. In as much as we could, I mean, we put a lot of effort, and Sergio is here. Actually, my main contribution to this seminar started before it began, which was suggesting you to contact Sergio, because he's someone that will bring important issues for our discussion here. So, and I'll take this sentence that you quoted, Ms. Waris, saying that I mean the surcharges could have been abolished, but it would be too radical. And at some point during the discussions at the fund, we wanted to get like the clear basis of, let's say, technical or policy basis for the proposals put on the table. And the only thing that they could come with is, well, this is what can gather sufficient support for the approval. So it was not a real discussion in terms of, I mean, how the IMF how the charges and surcharges policy of the IMF should be to meet the interests of the membership and of the people living in our member countries. And I think there is something like a moral approach to that, but not in the good sense that, it could be that we are part of a global community and the multilateral institutions should act in a cooperative way to support countries in difficulty. And actually, this is the very purpose of these institutions, to provide a global platform to help countries that are facing difficulties to smooth their adjustment efforts and alleviate some of the burden that the situation could cause to their populations. But no, the moral approach that unfortunately we see by many with, let's say, strong voices at the board is that, those countries, they made mistakes, now they need to pay for it. It's basically something like, it's hard even to talk about this because you are kind of punishing the people by mistakes that may have been committed, but also, the situation may have been due to exogenous shocks, to so many other factors that led to the crisis. So I think it's very unfortunate that we end up with a discussion, around those stances. Let me just say briefly, the purpose of the policy is basically, in terms of charges, you need to cover the intermediation costs for the lending activity of the fund, because in the new income model of the fund, the fund should be sustainable without the need of any income coming from its lending activity. But the lending activity should be sufficient to generate income to cover for the additional expenses that the fund incurs to provide that lending, which is fair. But then there is also this other component, which is, well, it should also contribute to the effort to build up reserves at the fund. You build up reserves by generating a net income, which is, in common language, profit at the fund. And then there is this additional aspect, which is like some exposed feature in determining the rate of charge, which is after you calculate the margin that's needed to cover the lending expenditures, the lending costs, and after you define, how much you want that specific instrument to contribute to building reserves, you should check if it's reasonable from a market perspective. This is the market test that the fund does as after going through these two main factors determining the rate of charge. And the market test, of course, is very subjective. And this is something that would be linked to one function of these, both the charge policy, but especially in the surcharge policy, which is like the incentive aspect of these charges and surcharges. So the charges and surcharges should be so that you would not create an incentive for a country to go to the IMF because of the low cost of their financing. Well, we all know that the cost of IMF financing is not a financial cost. It's, I mean, everything that comes with it. And this is, I mean, countries don't go to the IMF because they're after cheap money. They go to the IMF because they are in crisis, because they have POP needs and they need some, and they have not access to market or other sources. So this is a last resort for countries that are in a situation in which they require support from an institution like the fund. And also it should be at a level that would incentivize early repayment so that the fund, I mean, the rotating nature of IMF resources should be kept. So I mean, you get the money, but then you repay as soon as you can so that the IMF should have sufficient money to lend to other countries. Of course, I mean, these are limitations that are inbuilt, unfortunately, in the framework that we have at the fund. It could be different, but it's not the case. I mean, the IMF is not able to, let's say, issue SDRs in situations of crisis in which it could leverage its resources to provide for members. And most advanced countries that have a majority of stakes at the fund, they always very reluctantly support any increase in IMF quotas, so keeping like IMF lending capacity limited, while it could be much larger, so that, I mean, this need to early repayment could be much less if you have more resources available at the fund. I mean, it's of course the incentive nature of these policies is highly questionable, and indeed you cannot find sufficient evidence to support that these policies work along these lines, providing incentives for the country to, let's say, not go to the IMF or repay them early. At the margin, you could say, yeah, it could work. I mean, if a country is getting better, if the costs are so high that you, I mean, you don't want to keep incurring in them, you end up repaying. That was the case of Brazil in 2005, for example. We repaid the fund and we created a problem for the fund because it was counting on the payment of these high charges from Brazil and other countries that had large programs at that point to generate the income that they needed. And the so-called new income model came exactly after Brazil, Argentina, Turkey repaid their loans and left the IMF without a source of income, and they had to elaborate on something different. But I mean, most importantly is the fact that there is no evidence at all that for these countries that require a large, exceptionally large support from the fund, have any incentive coming from these surcharges. Because, I mean, when a country come for an exceptionally large financial arrangement, they are in a dire situation. And if you say, okay, you get the money, but you pay me 10% per year, you say, okay, I'm going to do that because I have no option. And there is no incentive at all in having high surcharges, because, I mean, what you do at the end is you just make things worse for the countries that are incurring in these surcharges. I mean, and this is well known by everybody. There are many examples, and of course, you're taking money from other uses that would be much more important for their populations to pay the IMF and to generate this net income. And again, the net income aspect of the policy is, at the end of the day, the driver of the policy. The policy, even though you have this whole discussion about incentive, this moral approach, I mean, you committed a sin, now you need to pay. But at the end of the day, what has been driving these high charges and surcharges of the fund was this need or let's say impulse to generate net income and accumulate reserves. And along the past several years, we had a 15 billion SDRs target for the reserves. It was raised to 20, then it was raised to 25. We met the 25 target. And then what was the basis to keep pushing for higher charges and surcharges? There was no basis. But then the fact that the rich economies that would be able to contribute to the PRGT did not come with the needed resources forced the fund to find a solution to fund the PRGT by using this excessive net income / reserves to divert this to the PRGT. But when you do that, you're taking money from countries, middle-income countries, or even sometimes poor countries in crisis that are paying more than what they should be paying to fund the concessional arm of the IMF. Because I mean, you didn't find a proper solution for that. And even considering that you are not going to be able to have advanced economies cashing all what is needed, there was a simple solution to all of this, which was to sell gold. If the IMF had sold a small fraction of its gold stock, it would have sufficient money to fund the PRGT and allow it to be self-sustainable at a very high level of lending and fund capacity development activities. And why it didn't do that? Because unfortunately, and in this case, it was only one country that has a special minority and that has a weird legislation that says that any gold sales at the IMF needs to be approved by its Congress. So while everybody else agreed that we should sell gold to, I mean, have a proper funding for the PRGT, and then we could set the charges and the surcharges at levels, and we could get rid of surcharges or put it at a very, very low level. Whatever it would be, what could be feasible would be something that would be way better than what we got. And instead of that, we needed, I mean, the grand consultation was to keep these charges and surcharges at much higher level so that we could keep generating a high net income and then could fund the PRGT. So, I mean, this is, of course, all wrong. Unfortunately, the voices of developing countries of the board at the board, they are loud, but they cannot change a decision like that because we don't get the sufficient majority for that. But I may assure you that we kept this discussion under pressure until the very last moment, and we got a lot of pushback from well, I won't say anything here. Perhaps it would go beyond what I should be saying. But I mean, this is in a chaotic way some of the issues that I wanted to raise, and sorry for perhaps taking too long. Thank you.
No, thanks a lot, Bruno, for this insights and for being open. And it is raising a big question, a big question about the governance. and the reform of this global economical architecture, and where we are as global South people, where we fill in this equation, and apparently solutions like adding a third African chair, a fourth African chair, even a fifth African chair will not solve the problem. It's peanuts. And what we need is a system that is just and fair, not only controlled by one big rich economy that is only working for their own interests, not for people, not for this planet. And Dr. Waris here actually mentioned a very important component, the climate change. And I by here want to say that as I live in Morocco, and Morocco was one of the countries we're supposed to pay surcharge this year. And we all know the ecological disaster that Morocco faced last year, the earthquake. And this year we were facing floods. And yet still, Morocco rushed to pay this share of the debt this year, despite all the challenges, the economical challenges, the ecological challenges, the climate change. Despite everything, they run not to pay surcharges. So that's, for me, raising a big question. The 36%, yes, they help some countries, but yet still, this policy is still harmful and still against human rights. And by Morocco case, and actually Egypt case, and many cases in Africa and the MENA Africa and the global South and the global actually structure, Ukraine is paying surcharge. Also, Argentina is paying surcharge. So it's still against the Article 1 of the IMF. So I want to listen to Sergio, but allow me first to say thank you for Attiya for being here. I know you have to leave; it's very late at your time. So thanks a lot for being there, and this is the discussion will be continued. Thanks a lot, Attiya. And I want to listen to Mr. Sergio, but allow me first to go to my colleague Ivana, because we are speaking about the impacts of surcharges. So Ivana, as being an essential part of the campaign, as CEPR being one of the main key players of the Stop the IMF Surcharge campaign, please tell us more about the impacts of surcharges on GDPs, on countries' GDPs, and the impacts of surcharges, and what are we expecting? And then I would love to go to Sergio. Ivana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shereen.
I'm sorry, Ivana. Allow me to switch to Arabic. يوجد ترجمة للعربية. أرجوكم اضغطوا على الدائرة أو الكرة الأرضية في أسفل الشاشة لسماع الترجمة. Ivana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I would just like to share my PowerPoint if possible, so I can show you some figures. All right.
Are you able to share from your side?
Okay. Yes, I think so.
Great, yes.
Can you see it?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. So thank you, Shereen. I'm going to briefly talk about the reform, the implications, and present some new estimates for surcharges calculated by CEPR, which are coming up in an upcoming paper by Michael Gallant and me, and also show, like colleagues before me, why this policy remains problematic. Okay, next slide. Right, so in the papers published in the IMF's review, they basically corroborated what all of us have been saying for years, in that the number of surcharge-paying countries had reached a historic high in 2024. At its peak, 23 countries were paying surcharges. Borrowers were paying surcharges for longer periods of time, and there was a mounting reputational risk to the IMF due to all of our pressure. So basically, the reform came down to decreasing basic charges, which are added to the SDR rate from 100 to 60 basis points for all countries borrowing from the general resources account. And then the surcharge fees themselves were actually almost untouched. So the time-based surcharges were reduced from 100 basis points to just 75. And then the bigger change came from the increase of the quota, so the amount of debt that surcharges are applied to. And commitment fees, which are often refunded, were also, their threshold was increased. So what does this mean? One of the bigger implications and actually revelations that came from this review is that the IMF admitted that the incentives, like Mr. Saraiva mentioned already, that they don't work for countries facing large and protracted financing needs. So these are the highly indebted countries. And this is very clearly illustrated when you look at the top 5 surcharge payers on the left. And they're paying 90% of all surcharges, and they have been for a number of years, and we expect them to continue this. And this really speaks to, you know, the structure of the policy and how it has stayed the same, right? The reform was really marginal, and leaving the structure in place means that this pattern is going to continue. And in the reform papers, they say this very clearly. Both in relation to level-based and time-based surcharges. So even for, time-based, they reviewed, on a case-by-case basis and concluded that time-based surcharges seem to work before 2016. So for cases relating to the global financial crisis. And then that the evidence after that is a bit spotty, which means, they're using European advanced economies as an example of countries, who this may have worked for, whereas we know the countries, especially the biggest payers that are subject to surcharges today, are very different. They're middle-income countries. They're in deep and protracted crisis, and these incentives certainly do not work. One of the other revelations from the reform is about the threshold. So by the IMF's calculation, the threshold of, what used to be 187.5% actually erodes over time, depending on some macroeconomic indicators. And so they calculated that in real terms, were they to realign the threshold to what it was in 2016, it would need to increase to 280% of quota. And so we know now that it's 300% of quota, that, while we thought that might be a big change from 187% to 300%, in real terms, it's actually very, very small. So it's basically just reverting close to what it was a few years ago. And now I'll talk about our estimates for surcharges in the future. So the IMF has projected that as a result of the reform, the number of countries paying surcharges will be reduced from 19 to 10 starting now. But in fiscal year 2026, this will increase to 13 countries. And we've had them listed here according to their credit outstanding to quota ratio. And what you'll notice is that at the bottom, Suriname, Kenya, and Sri Lanka have fallen below the new threshold temporarily. But these are the countries whose debt is actually expected to increase. And so they're going to end up paying surcharges again in the future, which also speaks to how the structure of the policy has remained in place. And what we've seen before might keep happening, where more countries continue to pay surcharges. And in addition to these, we've also identified 5 more countries that are at risk of paying in the future because their credit outstanding to quota ratios are close to the new threshold. So in actual numbers, we've calculated surcharge estimates, so average annual payments per year for these countries, as well as total payments. And in the far right column, you can see our estimates before the reform, so you can make a comparison. But in total, from 2025 to 2030, the IMF will levy an estimated $5.2 billion in surcharges, and this is about 4.7 billion less than CEPR's estimate for the same period before the reform, which was 9.9 billion. But this figure, you'll note, also includes, the countries that have stopped paying surcharges. So it's not necessarily a reduction of just these 13, but all of the ones that have been taken out temporarily or not. And in terms of interest payments, with the lending margin having been reduced, we expect that these 13 countries will pay 18.5 billion in interest charges, down from 20.4 billion before the reform. And if you look at it by country, Argentina alone is expected to pay more than half of the total, so $3.1 billion, down from 4.9 billion. And several other countries are still deeply impacted, including Ukraine, which will pay over $860 million, and Ecuador, nearly 640 million. And looking at the actual reduction in the headline rate, so here, what we've shown you is, starting at the bottom, the IMF's lending margin, then the SDR rate, and then the two surcharge rates on top of that. And this pink line at the end, you'll see after October, symbolizes the reform and what these figures look like after the reform. And so, basically, the reduction of the rate for all GRA countries is actually only from 444 basis points to 404. And then for the surcharge paying countries, or rather countries that are paying both the level and time-based surcharges, the headline rate decreased from 744 to 679 basis points at the time of the reform. And, again, this is on debt above the threshold. But all that is to say, these changes look pretty minor when you're looking at the rates themselves. And before I wrap up, just a note on the politics of the reform, which Mr. Saraiva has already touched on quite a lot. But, the reform was presented as this kind of great consensus, but we do know that decisions at the fund are fundamentally shaped by the balance of power, with the US, having by far the greatest formal vote and veto. And we know that the US Treasury Department has resisted demands to fully eliminate or, substantially reform the surcharge policy in the past. And with, the income now going to the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, even though the IMF has met its targets, right, and has gone beyond them, we can conclude that what's happening is that wealthy countries are essentially compensating for their own unwillingness to support low-income countries by using surcharges to punish highly indebted developing countries and use that income, for the PRGT, which, like Mr. Saraiva said, is, it's very wrong and counterproductive. And to conclude, we can see that the reform did provide a measure of relief, sometimes temporary, and it did reduce surcharge fees overall. But even so, they remain an unjustified and pro-cyclical burden, especially for the most indebted countries. And, with the review scheduled to take place in 5 years, we actually don't think that, one has to wait for 5 years to take action. Again, there's precedent for the removal of surcharges even outside of a formal review period. We know that the IMF has eliminated similarly failed policies on charges and surcharges in the past, in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And, we believe that we can do this again. So, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ivana, and yes, we are going to keep pushing to eliminate surcharges. And thank you for shedding the lights on the impacts of surcharges in our economy. And I remember during the flow of the work of the campaign, we in the MENA region, we were trying to do some estimation if we were not make pay surcharges. So for example, in Jordan, if Jordan wasn't paying surcharges, that actually will help Jordan to build around 200 schools, and there is an education problem in Jordan. If Egypt wasn't paying surcharges, that would contribute this amount of it was during the COVID time of vaccines free of charge, free of rapid facility or fast facility, either the bank on the funds. It means more debt for us if we were not paying surcharges in Egypt. If Tunisia wasn't paying surcharges, how that will contribute in rebuild the health sector in Tunisia. So in that, I want to go to Mr. Sergio Shoro, the Chief Legal Officer of Argentina Crown Point Energy, who was a former EG and at the IMF, and I know I want to listen to you on your point of view on these surcharges, and given the fact that also Argentina was one of the most indebted countries and was paying a huge amount of surcharge. Sergio, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Shereen, and thank you all for inviting me, Amena and Bruno, for bringing me up. You're being more than generous on your remarks, and I really miss our time together. I'm sure we'll get in touch sometime soon in the future. First disclaimer: I just put there the position I'm being lawyer of a small oil company. So the views are absolutely mine, of course, not of Argentina at this point. But having been in the board for several years in many instances in two blocks, I speak on my personal view from that experience alone. So let me recap a little bit on this and where it started, because I think it's important. I think Bruno touched upon this a little bit. We found out about surcharges in the calculations and negotiations on what should be the successor program to the most failed program in the history of the fund from our perspective, which was the 2018 SBA to Argentina, which is, by the way, mentioned on the side on the very recently issued report of the Independent Evaluation Office on Exceptional Access Policy, which I highly recommend everyone reads because it has some bearing into this discussion. We were discussing our projections and whether the new program would fit or not an SBA. And since we didn't know about surcharges, in our view, we were between the SBA and the EFF. And then we realized that for the perspective of the team of Argentina, it wasn't. And then we compared numbers, and then they had much higher numbers. And then where do those come from? Oh, the surcharges. And one of the things that struck me from scratch was the absolute level of obscurity, purposeful obscurity on surcharges. We tried to find out who paid, how much, since when, why, did they know, did they have a strategy? And we started realizing that most countries did not know that they were paying surcharges. I'm not going to make names, but countries in, Central Asia did not know. Countries that were in the constituency of countries that were totally pro surcharges did not know that they were paying surcharges. Countries in the Caribbean did not know that they were paying surcharges because they didn't even have the technical capabilities of doing so. So one of the first fights was putting this into light. And I would consider that apart from the slight shift in policy, and I more than share all the shortcomings that Ivana and Bruno were explaining, and yourself, Shereen, the issue of it being transparent now is a major achievement and a major victory, and it allowed you guys from civil society to push it forward and do a better job on how this could be tackled. So in a way, I want to make a testament on that fight and the letters from academics and all that, because at least we achieved the level of transparency. And why was that important? First, it was in the open. Then it was very resisted. I mean, we were in the Argentine side, we were almost bashed about bringing this out to light. But I think the most important element was when you put it in the open, the level of contradictions of the tenets become a little bit more self-evident. And the absurdity of the whole policy becomes a little bit more evident. For instance, the whole discourse, the whole idea, and this Bruno explained well, and the whole ethos of the policy is you need an incentive to graduate because you're not going to use other people's money to maintain your cheap financing. Well, first, that is flawed because no one goes to the fund for financing. The fund itself proclaims there to be the provider of a program of which the financing is just but an element. So if you think that someone is only for the money, then you are downplaying the element of the program. And supposedly the money is only accessory to the program. So you begin with levels of self-contradiction that you cannot explain. The other one that I like a lot is if it's an incentive, but then you need it as an essential part of your income policy to build your precautionary balances, quote unquote, which is what Bruno was referring as the reserves, then the two objectives are self-contradictory because either you want me to leave or you want me to finance your buffers. I mean, you cannot want me to leave and finance your buffers at the same time. It's either or, right? But then if you have those two tenets in the open, then you cannot really justify very thoroughly the whole element of the policy. Then the issue of the precautionary balances themselves. And this, Bruno was explaining how, the goal was moved every so often that you would kind of stop it or curve it, right? The main thing that I find fascinating about the need, quote unquote, to fill the precautionary balances is that they are totally unneeded. Why are they unneeded? Because there's no track record of default or protracted arrears to the fund significant. I mean, only failed states do that. And that is because the fund is the lender of last resort. So if you need precautionary balances, you're thinking of yourself as a commercial institution. If you're a commercial institution, you're not the lender of last resort. If you don't trust and you think that people are for the money, then you don't trust your own programs. And if you need these balances, then maybe your whole position as preferred creditor status is not justified because if we know it's a status, it's only justified in as much as you don't behave as other creditors because you get in when people get out. If you need precautionary balances, it's because if you are changing your self-perception into something that is different from your nature. And then again, you have another contradiction in tenets. So the fact of it having been shown in the open is that it showed this kind of problems of contradictions. And I think that all this are very, very important elements and how they were questioned / attacked. Bruno touched briefly on the issue of Europe and the findings that it may have helped the issue of incentives in Europe. Well, the issue of incentive and graduation is only relevant as much as you have an alternative source of financing. Everybody wants to leave the fund. because no one wants to have their sovereignty slashed out and subject to a constant review. That's the issue of the programs. You're not being financed by a financier. This is not development financing. All the opposite. It's adjustment financing. Is anti-development financing. Hence, you go out depending on whether or not you have available resources. So either Brazil and Argentina 2005 had accumulated enough reserves, they used the reserves as slimly legally as possible to pay the fund, and you get out. Or you do what the Europeans did, Portugal especially, which is you grab on your European fund and you increase your exposure there to leave. Now, what the fund doesn't say is that the incentive is not in the norms. This is the finding of alternative financing. So if you're not belonging to the European realm and you don't have available public sources, you cannot leave. Hence, the policy tends to perpetrate you're there because you need the financing from the fund to pay the fund. And there you start going into the realm that the fund is very problematic for it to self-realize, which is the balance of payment problem. The fund has a very hard time dealing with the fact that the balance of payment problems can, and in many cases do, originate in the fund itself. Because they're ill-prepared for that. They think that there's always a solution. And then the problem is the fund cannot self-perceive itself as the problem. And that generates another level of cognitive problems and another issue of tenet contradiction. One of the very side collateral, almost footnotes, that is interesting from the report of the IAO I was mentioning, the one on exceptional access, is by their account, a third or less of programs were successful. So we do have that. Going into the specificities of the reform, I think that conceptually the worst one is the use for PRHT. That is, if we had done it in the other side, it's the tectonic institutional violation of the concepts very markedly. It's a use of resources from sources that need financing into other sources that need financing. And it appears that the grantor is the one that is failing to finance. So it is like, your rich neighbor getting your poor maid to subsidize the poor son of the nurse, but with him as intermediary. It's like horrendous. Please edit this part though later on. So conceptually, I think that that's the worst part, especially because that comes from the failing of even complying with the PRGT. And frankly, the issue that they could not comply with the PRGT is mind-boggling because they don't even have the problem of credit quality. Remember, the PRGT is not an asset where if you put money, you get something less than a reserve quality asset. The whole purpose of the PRGT was that it would be financeable in as much as it had the tag of reserve asset. So if you cannot comply with something you crafted very wisely to have a tag of reserve asset that is the main impediment for it to be financed, then there's a problem of willingness. But the very essential willingness, not even general willingness to do good, is just mind-boggling to me. I mean, I never thought that would happen. But then the issue of how we solve the problem is like jaw-dropping. Anyway, The other element I find,
Sergio, you have actually 1 minute.
I'm sorry, and I finished with this one. The last element, I think that it's regrettable because I always tried it to be like that, and I like the Ivana's referral on the threshold, the kicker of the threshold, is if they're gonna keep it, they should at least tag it to exceptional access. Because I still don't understand how you can defend that you're going to put a surcharge that it has a different threshold than exceptional access. It should, if they're going to construct the argument, at least they should put it at a par with exceptional access. If not, it doesn't make it makes even less sense. And that would have given you a pretense of justification. And I can never understand why then they'll just say, whatever exceptional access is, that's going to be the trigger. Thank you, and sorry for taking all that time.
No, thank you. Thanks a lot, Sergio, for sharing and being open. I mean, it's very interesting intervention, and I'd like to have more discussions about those views. And but for the sake of the time, and we want also to open the floor to our colleagues to reflect and interact. But I want to first, before opening the floor, to give the floor to my colleague, my partner in crime, Louise Vieira from Bretton Woods Project. We for years we're working together on this campaign, and with also others from different organizations, specifically especially CEPR, Michael, Alex, and Ivana, and others. So Louise, the floor of is yours, and you're having 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. This has been extremely useful and interesting. I wanted to begin by obviously thanking Shereen, the colleagues at MENAFem, people at CEPR, and others for helping organize this. Also, obviously, Bruno and Sergio, I think your inputs were extremely useful and enlightening. So thank you very much. I suppose I think my tasks that was given to me was to reflect a little bit on these dynamics and what are the implications for the campaign, right? So, well, obviously it's very heartening to hear from Bruno and Sergio that civil society pressure and working with academia, etc., and others was pivotal in A, making the issue more transparent, and B, bringing about pressure for change. So that those are very important things, which would give one hope. On the other hand, I think what I found very interesting about the discussion and the perspectives of both Bruno and Sergio is the degree, I think it helps us to better understand one of the key questions we've been asking ourselves for a long time, which is, to what extent is research that highlights the inherent contradictions of IMF policy and prescriptions useful in our advocacy campaigns? Because, you can see Bruno and Sergio's inputs really make it put beyond doubt the fact that the IMF's rhetoric and construction of itself outwardly as technocratic, capable managers of economies in distress is patently, as Sergio said, there's so many contradictions within the way it operates with its own outwardly facing rhetoric. So I think to me, what's very useful is to realize, I think this helps us to understand something we've already known, right? We've always known that these issues are in the heart of it political issues. They have to deal with the distribution of power within the bank, the fund, and other institutions, and within the global economy at large. So I think reflecting on this, I think there is scope for us. It all shows. I think the comments and the discussion all demonstrate the extent to which, not all across all areas, but there are certainly areas in which we could do better to work with representatives of member states at the bank and the fund and other institutions to see how we can better, from the outside, support their internal battles. That I'm sure, Bruno and Sergio, they have their own struggle, but as they both said, representing members of the Global South. And considering that the two, there's two constituencies, they're multi-state constituencies, but Brazil and Argentina, they're not insignificant states. So if you think that their interests have difficulty in being reflected in board discussions, you wonder about the Chads and Libyas of the world. So I think these are very important considerations as we look forward. And there's obviously then an inherent connection with the discussions that are taking place around in advance of the fourth Financing for Development Conference in Sevilla in Spain next year. I don't know how many of you who are following the discussions, but one of the pivotal discussions that's being held is there is the FFD, the Financing for Development Conference, and the working papers, the elements paper, there is a lot of reference to the reform of the financial architecture. But the global North states are very keen that, for example, reform to the IMF and the World Bank be constrained to discussions at the board level. They don't want to allow those discussions to take place outside in a UN system where you have, well, if you forget for a second the Security Council, you have a one country, one vote system. So, I think that it would be helpful for us to work with, our representatives in the Global South, in the bank and the fund, to get pressure from them internally within the board. And I realize this is extremely difficult to push for those countries, because what happens also, and I'm sure, I presume Bruno and Sergio would be able to speak about this also, there's a disconnect also sometimes between the stance taking by the ministers of finance and treasury at the bank and the fund, and the ministers of foreign affairs at the other end at the United Nations. So, also bridging those gaps within the states around their positioning between the different ministries, it would be quite helpful. So, those I think are my initial thoughts. I'll end with this, which is something that a more macro analytical point, I suppose, and something that Bruno mentioned. One wonders why it is, if you really want to if you think that the international financial architecture and multilateralism is under threat, you think that the global North would want a fully funded, effective international monetary funder of last resort. And yet, as Bruno said, it's almost as if the IMF is constituted in a way that it can respond to some crises, but it's not large enough to really become the true lender of last resort that would force all states to work through multilateral institutions. And it's not a secret. You don't have to think too much about, for example, maybe the US government, even before Trump, has never been interested in having a very well endowed, capable IMF, because it allows states to operate outside the multilateral system. So, I think as we think as a society about, of course, we must continue to work on the surcharge policies. We must continue to highlight these contradictions. But, as our work goes well beyond the surcharges. So, in thinking about it was very interesting to hear Sergio, mention the report and the very low success rate of IMF programming, which is something that we always say. So I guess one of the things that we must consider jointly is how can we better make our research that highlights our contradictions more impactful politically within the fund. Thank you very much. I hope that's of some use. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Luis. That definitely was very helpful. And I actually join you on the call of maybe we were having a chance through the upcoming FFD next year in Sevilla. And I believe we are going forward through a very important moment. Again, surcharge is part of the unfair debt cycle that we're living under in the Global South. And it's in the MENA region, we are facing climate crisis, war, economical crises. We are one of the most impacted regions that will face a famine next 2 years. So it's a complex of crisis that needs an immediate debt cancellation. And so I want to remind everybody that there is a jubilee momentum on debt next year, and there is the FFD also work with FFD momentum that we need to push to a fair system, an accountability mechanism to this system, a governance reform. Civil society is gathering behind a debt framework under the UN system. And I believe my colleagues at MENAFem already mentioned that MENAFem launched the FFD MENA coalition. Please, for the MENA colleagues here from the SWANA, please fill the form. And Luis, I see your hand, and then I want to open the floor. Luis.
Thanks. I want to abuse my my access to ask a question. Actually, Bruno and Sergio. You know, I think one of the things that's striking to me is, on one hand, you have states in the global north talking about concern about the threats to the multilateral system, right? And you have the rise of the BRICS, the expansion of the BRICS. And I'm wondering if both of you, well, I guess Sergio, you're out a bit, but maybe this was something that was relevant during your time at the fund also. To what extent was the discussion around the surcharges linked to efforts by the global north, like the reduction of surcharges presented or framed within the discussion around in bolstering the legitimacy of the multilateral system? So is that how, because I know that we as civil society were putting forward, you know, the arguments of contradictions, the pro-cyclicality, etc. But I wonder internally within the fund, was the global south making an argument around the legitimacy and the threats to multilateralism? I think it would be very interesting to understand that from the inside. Thanks.
Thank you, Luis. And I will consider this the first question to the floor, and allow me to open the floor to our colleagues here. I will shift to Arabic. الباب النقاش الآن مفتوح للدقائق القادمة. أرجو منكم الكتابة في Q&A أو رفع اليد. أنا أرى إنجريد ووكر. هل من الممكن لإنجريد أن تتحدث؟ أنا أتكلم عن المسؤولين عن اللوجيستكس. هل من الممكن لإنجريد أن تتحدث؟ Ingrid, can you speak? Ingrid, do you want to come? We want to take the floor? If not, please write your question in the Q&A. I can see your hand. أمينة أو داليا، ممكن حد يقول لي إذا كان إنجريد ممكن تتكلم؟ Oh, that was an accidental hand raise. Okay. Okay, let me go through what was written in the chat before. There was a lot of discussion related to what Louise actually mentioned, and there was a lot of contribution from our colleagues, from other African colleagues around the fund interventions in our countries, and how the fund is actually still dealing with the surcharges, and how the IMF as being the last resource, and yet still jeopardizing the economies of the countries. So how this contradiction can be tackled, So allow me to go back to our panelists. Please answer and in a couple of minutes, and also put your last remarks, because I'm sorry, we're running out of time. So I'll first go to Bruno. The floor is yours, Bruno.
Thank you very much, Shereen. I'll try to be very brief here, because I think many points have been already made in the discussion so far. So trying to address the two issues raised by Luis. First, if research is useful, I would say, in short, yes. The fact that the fund, the IMF board is like a consensus-driven kind of forum makes it like, in theory, susceptible to arguments being made in a consistent and well-based way. Of course, at the end of the day, some stances are given by the capitals that are not participating directly in the discussion we have there. But we can feel in several moments that when we can present a point with very strong arguments, we at least can embarrass people on the other side and make them think that it could have some cost if the discussion becomes public. So this interlinkage between well-founded discussion at the board and transparency, so that it could be taken to civil society more openly, provide some leverage for these, the chairs representing the Global South, because we don't have sufficient votes. But I'm gonna commit an act of self-plagiarism, because in my recent remarks at the firewall session at the board, I said that it's very important, the fact that the IMF has this, the board has this idea of trying to build consensus, because it assumes that you should be able to move from your initial position to bring something to get to some point in which we could move ahead. But the point that I made at that session was, first, consensus is not submission. It's actually, it should be the opposite of it. Consensus should be the result of a debate in which ideas are put in a freely and clear way. And we need to resist any attempt to asphyxiate the discussion at the board, because this has this is how we can set some cracks, especially in this interlinkage, as I say, with the world outside the IMF. And the second point is consensus should not be an excuse not to move, or to move much slower than what should be the case. Because some people just say, no, we can only go that far, and there is no consensus, so let's keep it as is. So that's exactly using consensus as a way to maintain things as they are, and this is also unacceptable. And I believe that having strong arguments, having strong arguments on one hand, but necessarily having this transparency in this connection with civil society is fundamental to keep putting pressure on those chairs or those countries that resist to changes at the front. And I think that the issue of threats to multilateralism, it has been raised at the board. People are aware that we are living in a historical juncture in which all the architecture that was built in the aftermath of World War II are put into question. Not only that, but even let's say more generally, we are in a period in which even the democratic institutions are being questioned worldwide. So it's a very complicated situation, and if we are to preserve both the multilateral system but also strong democratic institutions in our countries, this multilateral system and these institutions, they must deliver to the people. If they don't deliver to the people, of course, you erode the trust that people may have in both multilateralism and democracy. And I believe that both goes together, and the way to preserve multilateralism, the way to preserve democracy is exactly to deliver what people expect from these institutions. I'll stop here. Yeah.
Thank you, Bruno. And also last remarks, actually a minute, because we already at the time, our time is up, but thanks for our colleagues who are staying longer with us for the last session in the year, our 2025 gift for you guys. So, and I just want to reflect on a question in the chat in Arabic. تحدثت بالعربية. الزميلة منى عزب كانت تسأل عن تحرك جماعي نحو الديون. في الحقيقة مينا فام بصدد إنهاء الاستراتيجية اللي هنعمل consultations مع أعضاء مينا فام والشركاء في أول السنة، وسنرسل لجميع المهتمين، أرجو إرسال إيميل لنا موعد اللقاء حول الديون. شكرا. And Ivana, 1 minute from you. Ivana, are you still with us?
Yes, sorry, I couldn't hear you. Could you please repeat?
The floor is yours. 1 minute to recap.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I would reiterate that this reform really was tinkering at the edges. It left in place the structure of surcharges, which will continue to be a pro-cyclical burden on many countries, especially the highest, the most indebted ones. And on the upside, I think we can, use these precedents where the IMF has removed other charges and failed policies before, even outside of review periods, as something to push forward. Thank you.
Shereen?
Actually, the floor is yours, Sergio.
Yes, I just want to make a very brief comment on the question. I think it's a very valid question on was this put or discussed within the frame of the weakening of the global financial institutions and so on and so forth. I think that we have to realize that when people lose certain tax, they think of very different things that they represent. So if you are saying the effectiveness of the global financial institutions, that is a very different idea of what you might think about what that means from other, constituencies or stakeholders. For other constituencies and stakeholders, that means who holds the pan, period. For you, it might mean, do we have available resources to fight firewalls or buffers for vulnerable countries in terms of global shifts in global shift of shocks of capital getting in or out. So it is totally different what you would understand as other constituencies would understand, and you might be saying the same thing but thinking of totally opposite things. So for a lot of stakeholders, the crisis or risks of the international and global financial institution means, am I in threat of holding the pan, or who else could be threatening my holding of the pen, or what is the agenda of my challenger to the holding of the pen, period. And you might be thinking about availability of resources, increased global liquidity, what happens with the liquidity trap, what happens with those credit crunch in our countries, what does it mean for our currency, et cetera, et cetera. So you say the same thing, you mean different things. And that is part, that duality is also part of the discussion. And that's why the being of very precise, disciplined, and explicit, it is required, and it makes a difference.
Thanks a lot, Sir. That was very impressive and important and powerful too. Louise, the floor is yours. One last word.
I thankfully and very unlike myself have not much else to say. I just wanted to, I thought it was really very, very interesting, and above all, I think a very useful discussion, and I think it will give us plenty of food for thought for our continued advocacy on various different issues. Not only, I think one of the interesting things about the discussion was that while we were discussing surcharges, I think many of the insights are actually applicable well beyond the discussion about surcharges. So I'm just love to thank everyone for joining, and thank you, MENAFem, CEPR, for organizing. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Louise, and
thank you all.
It's still our beginning. It's still our beginning for more work to be done. And I just want to conclude and say that when we discuss the policies of the IMF and the impacts on people, it's crucial that we look beyond the cold statics and see individuals behind them. Those policies are not just abstract concepts or number of pages. They are real people. They impact real people that suffering those real consequences. Women in countries like Egypt, Pakistan, Morocco, Argentina, Brazil, they are bear the burdens of these policies forces that is sacrificing their or jeopardizing their health and education and livelihood, and for the sake of debt they never incurred. And as MENAFem, when we talk about those people, we are talking about our people, our own people, and the own collective humanity, about our mothers, our friends, our daughters, our sons, our friends, and our future. The inequality and the injustice we face reflects the vulnerability that the world is shaped to be, and we want this to stop. So let's not only hope for a better world, but let's fight to have a better world, and let's do more collective efforts that can actually bear or bring us more small victories like the surcharges, if we may say. Thanks a lot and happy new year. بشكركم جميعا، بشكر الحضور، شكرا على وجودكم معنا. بشكر المتحدثين سيركيو، برونو، لويز، إيفانا. شكرا على وجودكم كل اللي حضروا الندوة، وبشكر زمايلي في MENAFem اللي ما زالوا يعني على الضرب، سواء المؤسسات أو الزميلات اللي لحقوا بMENAFem مؤخرا. بشكر جميع الأعضاء في MENAFem، وسنة سعيدة وسنة جديدة. بشكر أكيد الترجمة، وبشكر أيضا الزملاء اللي ساعدونا في اللوجيستكس، و I wish you a happy new year. شكرا، مع السلامة.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Emma.
you.
Have a
Shukran.
good end of the year. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.